As I'm duty bound by the state of California to ask you if I may record this conversation. Dr. Adams.
Yes.
Very good. Very good indeed. So you are, I kind of narrated this a little bit with the last recording that I did with Tim Taylor. And the idea was that basically coming into COVID, I just couldn't understand how artificial life, particularly the history component of artificial life, would survive and continue on. And you are one of the kind of emerging new researchers in the field. How did you get involved with artificial life?
Actually, I got involved with it in graduate school back in, I think 2014 was when I first started. Maybe it was my first conference was in 2014 or 2015, but so I joined this artificial life lab, an origin of life lab at Arizona State University, run by a brand new professor at the university. Her name is Sarah Walker. Now she's like, she does all sorts of really cool stuff with assembly theory and artificial chemistries and things like that. But at the time, she was just starting her lab, and I was just starting graduate school, and I had no idea what I wanted to study. And I got this email in my inbox saying that there's this Origin of Life lab with Sarah Walker looking for graduate students, and physics PhD students should apply. And I was like, I didn't know you could do that as a physics student. So I joined the lab, and I was really excited. And a lot of the questions that she had available for grad students to look at was, defining what it means for something to be like life or non-life. Because if you're studying the origin of life, it seems like an important question. So then I got into that sphere of things, and within it was this big question of one of the defining features of living systems is open-ended evolution. And it turns out that there's this big open-ended evolution workshop at this conference called Artificial Life. And so I just got swept into it, and that was the end of that story. So I've been a part of Artificial Life ever since.
Very cool, very cool. I noticed you were at the Santa Fe Institute for a period of time. Did you work with Stephen Gurin there?
Oh no, actually, it was I wasn't even there physically. I was just being a teaching assistant for one of the online courses with Hector Zenal.
Oh,
It was
interesting.
super fun, but yeah, I've never actually been to the Santa Fe. I've never been to Santa Fe actually, so
Interesting, interesting.
kind of a
Okay.
bummer.
So you're currently a deputy director at CrossLaABS. Could you introduce what CrossLaABS is for the audience?
Of course. So it's a independent research lab that does artificial life, but the topic that it studies the most is trying to understand what intelligence is and redefining what it means to be like intelligent, or like what an intelligent system is. Because I mean, we often think about human intelligence as being the center of what it means to be intelligent and what problem solving is, and things have to have a brain and stuff like that. But I mean, when we look around biology and we consider like all sorts of different life forms, we quickly understand that that's not the case, right? Like plants have different notions of intelligence, ants have different notions of intelligence, particularly collective intelligence. And I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. So CrossLaABS, what we do is we try to study like what does that mean? Like, what does it mean to be intelligent, but also like, what does it mean to have intelligent technologies? And can we take ideas from science fiction and can we make them alive right now? So we're a private research lab, and which means we have a lot more freedom than labs at usually at universities, because we're not at a university. We get funded by all sorts of different sources like grants and companies and things like that. And because we're also part of a larger company called Compass, which is a AI company here in Japan. So yeah, we get to do all sorts of really cool stuff.
And in terms of your role as deputy director, what does a standard day look like for you?
Yeah, so a lot of it is just like I see my role as being like making sure that everybody has what they need to do what they want to do. So whether that's interns, whether that's research assistants, whether it's our senior science staff or admin, I want to make sure that everybody has the time and the space and the opportunities that they need in order to do whatever they want. So, like, that means tons of different things. It means writing grants, it means organizing workshops, it means making sure that people have funds for travel to different places. It also means writing papers and collaborating and let's see, like writing blog posts and making sure that people have opportunities to write their blog posts. It just, I mean, it means tons of different things. So on a day-to-day basis, like, I mean, I could be doing so many things.
How important is the creation of intellectual property? I mean, do you file patents? Do you do that kind of work with CrossLaABS?
Not usually. It's mostly open science, because you know, like we operate a lot like science-wise in terms of like a university lab. So all of our output is open and out there, super transparent, free to the public, because you know we rely on the network of. I mean, that's what science is about, right? Like everybody relies on like this idea of free collaboration and open ideas and things like that. But we do have a few things that are working directly with clients, specifically through Cross Compass. So, you know, there could be like a client project that we work on, and that would be under IP, of course, right? And that's because we're working with Cross Compass engineers to take something from science and turn it into a product for a client to test. So, but I would say that that's not the majority of what we do. The majority of what we do looks a lot more like just like any other research lab.
So a favorite topic of mine and Dr. Khan's has been associated with how artificial life is framed in a particular Japanese context. Can you give any background to this thinking?
Totally. And I'm only saying this as an observer, right?
Sure.
Like I am not an expert in Japanese philosophy and religion and things like that. But what it seems to me is this idea of, you know, I guess it's Shintoism, where everything has like agency, or maybe like you would call a spirit or something like that, like everything. And that is so baked into the culture, and people just like accept like, yeah, like the rock has its own like spirit, or like everything has its own agency in some sort of way. That's just like it's not even a question out here. And so when we're thinking about things like artificial life or like intel like AI systems, it's really easy to just dovetail into that sort of mindset because I mean, like it's just accepted. It's like, yep, of course, like computers are intelligent. Like, of course, like these agents, they have their own goals. Where in oh look, hello. Oh,
Speaking of intelligent agents, apologies for the viewers. I
oh,
forgot to bolt the door, and it does happen on occasion. But speaking of intelligent agents, yes, I have a couple of my own.
oh, that's so
In
cute.
terms of the broader philosophy, though, associated with the embodiment of artificial life, um, what's your thinking with regards to the perception of artificial life, for example, in the US versus the perception of artificial life in Japan? What are the contextual differences?
Well, I think, well, first of all, it's, you know, artificial life is just not that well known. I mean, like anybody I talk to, like just like somebody outside the field, even like other scientists, I'm like, oh yeah, I study artificial life, and they're like, what the heck is that? And then I like do my like whole like minute and a half like introduction to it, and they're like, oh my god, that sounds so cool. Like, I mean, people get really, really excited about this idea, but it doesn't seem it's different than like artificial intelligence, where if you talk to people, if I were to say like, oh, I work in an AI lab and I am trying to understand how to make AI self-evolve, people in the US are like, oh, so you're trying to build Skynet. Like I would say like 90% of people have that attitude, right? And I think it's because of like movies and like Hollywood, and of course like obviously like the movie Terminator and things like that. But like in the US, like those sorts of stories are so baked into our culture and how we see the world, that I think that it's already put like a like groundwork for saying that like, oh, like these sorts of things are scary. And then of course like it's not just that, right? But there's also like a lot of validity to it with corporate greed, and you have like these giant companies who are using AI to invade people's privacy and to take people's data without their permission, and to, I mean, like, not just take people's data, but also like use it to make a lot of money. Even like regular people, but also people who are super famous as well, like actors. I mean, they'll take their likeness without their permission, and they'll use it to make products making tons of money. So like, while it's not like Skynet kind of stuff, it's sort of a monster in its own that is like very capitalistic on its core. So I think there's a huge validity to that. But those are all companies in the US. And, you know, in Japan, you don't necessarily have that same mindset in terms of like an approach to using people's data, which is really, really refreshing. But going back to like this whole idea of artificial life, I feel like the field so far is very lucky in the sense that it's not met with the same sort of like reaction in terms of like in terms of the same kind of reaction that the US has for like artificial intelligence. But in Japan, you know, both AI and artificial life have the same positive, very welcoming, open-minded reaction that I think makes it so possible for the two fields to thrive out here. And, you know, while it's really difficult for AI to be competitive in Japan or anywhere that's not the US or China, I think that makes it really special for artificial life, because there's this culture that is really supportive and open and very excited about these sorts of ideas that are coming out of the field.
One of the things I found fascinating corresponding with you recently is that you don't speak Japanese. And I'm not sure, you don't read Japanese? Do you speak it at all? I mean, what is your relationship with the culture like in Japan, as a kind of Westerner who doesn't necessarily have the full integration with the language?
I'm trying to learn Japanese. It's just been a really slow process because it just does not fit in my brain. It's so terrible. Like I'll learn these Japanese words and my brain's just like, rather than labeling, oh yeah, okay, this word means that, it just, my brain goes, that's a Japanese word. And I'm like, no, but brain, just remember like what the word means. Don't just like label it as a Japanese word. So it's really hard for me to remember like what the words are, but I am learning. It's just excruciatingly slow. And so I can speak enough to order food and drinks and to know like the scripts at like, you know, the supermarket and the restaurant and the train, and I can get by, which is good. But like I mean, rather you know, outside of just the language, I absolutely love many aspects of the Japanese culture. I think, you know, I've ever since I was a kid, I've been really fascinated with Japanese culture and society. Really love the food. You know, I didn't come into it with the kind of angle of being an anime fan, which I think is what a lot of people get into Japanese culture with. But rather, I came into the like into the fascination with the philosophy. I really enjoyed Shintoism. I think it's very fascinating. I also enjoyed like the aspect, like I especially really enjoyed this idea that people can be, you know, can go into a Shinto shrine and then they can go to like another religious shrine and then another religious shrine. And like there's no religious wars over it. Like people are just like, yeah, nope, that's totally fine. For me, who grew up evangelist, it was like that to me was just like, oh my God, because like, you know, in the culture that I grew up in, if you said like like going to church on a Saturday versus going to church on a Sunday, oh my God, like they're totally different. Like they're so wrong. Like they're obviously on the wrong path. So like this was like really, really, really new to me. So yeah, I there's a lot that I really enjoy, and I honestly feel like I'm very at home in Japan, which I thought was really surprising.
This is an interesting response. Let's talk a bit about Profound, because I certainly enjoyed at the Euro conference your particular section on Profound and hearing the various speakers, and specifically their use of LinkedIn I found particularly interesting. But for folks listening in, for folks watching more importantly, could you introduce what Profound is?
Of course. So it's this group of people, basically like postdocs and well, people with PhDs and people who are career counselors and life coaches. We got together and we were like, you know what? It's really, really hard for people with PhDs or people who are in grad school to find careers outside of academia. And it's because that the university is not really set up to help researchers find jobs outside of academia. Now, I would say that computer science departments are different. They're very good at it. But for all the other departments, it's sort of like you're introduced to one kind of career and that's pretty much it, which is unfortunate because there are so many different careers out there that are well suited for PhDs. And so when I was in grad school, it was really difficult for me to unlock even learning about what these were. So I had to rely a lot on LinkedIn and like talking to people. It was it was just really hard to figure out like how do I crack this nut, right? So Profound, what we do is we want to make this easier for people. We like there are a few different companies out there that will do this and they charge money to people who have PhDs. We don't charge money to people who have PhDs. We think this should be free. I mean, you're already spending a lot of time and money on your education. Why would you have to spend more money in order to figure out what you should do with your education? That's just crazy. So what we do is we help people and we get the funds from the companies because like they are already spending like millions and millions of dollars trying to get people to learn what sort of jobs and opportunities they even have. So like we charge them less than what they're already spending for these searches. So it's a win-win for everybody. Like they get to save a ton of money on their like search methods, and PhDs get to learn about like the kinds of things that companies do. So yep, that's what we do, and you know we're still figuring it out. It's been quite the journey, but like we love it. We love what we do.
One of my favorite things about working in technology is you occasionally meet people who appear to be wiser than you and more learned. And some of them have PhDs, some of them don't have PhDs. But one of the interesting conversations I had with a friend of mine who worked for, let's just say, a fruit packing related company. We were outside a conference somewhere in San Francisco in about 2015. And he said to me, I need an additional $2 million a year in order to retire by the time I'm 60. And I looked at him and I thought, I have a rough idea of the amount of money you're making. I think it's probably somewhere in that ballpark. What does retirement mean from financial planners? Obviously, they have their own particular perspectives. How does retirement fit into the Profound perspective?
Yeah, amazing question. A lot of it has to do with education of like what does retirement mean to you? Because it means something different to everybody. Same with like success, same with like financial security. I mean, all of these have it's just like different meanings. There's no like one size fits all for everybody. Like your friend's example, right? So a part of what we do is trying to help people like understand what is important to them, because I think a lot of people, like even myself when I was in grad school, I was looking for somebody to tell me what these mean for me. But it turns out that if you sit around and wait for that, like you might not like the answer, or it's just like completely wrong for you, or something like that. And it just feels very uncomfortable. So what we do is we just talk to people like one on one and be like, what are your values? Like, what do you care about? Like, what is happiness to you? Like, what is success to you? Like, what makes you smile? Like, what makes you feel like, wow, I'm doing really good in life? And all of those things give a lot of clues onto what these very practical matters actually look like. So, you know, first it's all about finding um, what you care about, what your values are, what like really makes you want to get up in the morning and gives you a ton of energy and like super excited to just do things. And then we translate that into things that are actionable. Like, okay, so what does that mean? Does that mean like opening up a Roth IRA account? Does that mean like trying to find a company that you can work in for 40 years? Does that mean trying to understand what different investment portfolios look like and trying to retire that way? Who knows? I mean, it's just an ongoing conversation, but I think that's what makes it a lot of fun is it's an adventure for a lot of people to really find out what that is, and there's a lot of joy and discovery, I think.
Certainly, certainly. So you had some questions for me, which I thought were fascinating. If we could dive into them. Before that, let's do the top 5 papers, artificial life papers of all time. I know you had a bunch of them. They were all fascinating. Just off the top of your head, what are your top 5 artificial life papers of all time?
It's hard to say because I don't really know if they count as artificial life papers, but I mean, I'll talk about them anyways just because I love them. I mean, so a lot of the papers that I personally find fascinating because of my own view of artificial life have to do with this idea of physical computation. Like, what does it mean to compute something? Because I think that computation is a amazing way to understand how dynamical systems process information, and to me that's like personally like the core of artificial life. So like one of the papers that I loved from graduate school was this functional dynamics one by uh Kato Katakoa and Kuniko. This was a paper from the year 2000, but I found it absolutely amazing to understand, like, what does it mean to have a dynamical system that computes things? And it has to do with things like universal computation and reversibility and all sorts of things like that. So that's one of them. And then another one that I really enjoyed, let's see, was actually, it's not a paper, it's a book, and it's called An Immense World. What is it called? Like, it's called, yeah, An Immense World by Ed Young. Ed Young, and it's basically about, it's a longer version of the idea of what is it like to be a bat. So Ed Yong goes on like this adventure of all these different animals and asks these biologists, what is it like to be a what is those shrimps? Those rainbow ones that they can see and then they can punch. I don't remember what it's called. What's it like to be a shrimp? What's it like, obviously, to be a bat? What's it like to be a squid? What's it like to be just all these different things and so many adventures there. I absolutely loved that one, and it's very a lifey for sure. And then there was a recent paper that came out this year called Software in the Natural World, a computational approach to hierarchical emergence, which was a really, really cool adventure. And that's by Fernando Rosas and Geiger Bernard and Andrea Lupi and Anil Seth and Daniel Polanyi and others, which is amazing. So that's a great one. My classic go-to when I think about my favorite papers, or like I guess set of papers or idea in A Life, is Stu Kaufman's favorite thing to talk about is the number. It's like not just the adjacent possible. I love that idea, right? But also this idea of the number of uses for a screwdriver, because it makes me think so much about like contextualism. Like, what does it mean to be an observer, or like what does it mean to be an agent who is trying to make functional things in the system? So love that set of ideas, love all the essays and papers there. So anyways, I wouldn't say it's the top 5 papers in A Life, but those are like some of my favorite top 5 papers.
Embodiment is really fascinating. I mean, certainly the old bioticasts would talk about the embodiment of being a spider. Like, can you actually understand what it is to be a spider? And I, obviously coming from Australia, had a very particular perspective of spiders. They were large, they'd crawl over my face when I was camping. And, they would fight birds, which I think was an ongoing discussion point anyway. So yes, certainly a favorite topic of mine as well. So you had a few questions for me associated with what I see in the next 5 and next 10 years. You've had the opportunity of having the conversation interrupted by some of my favorite artificial life simulations. And the thing that fascinates me, there's a piece of software called Breve, which was written by a fellow called John Klein. Kyle Harrington represented that in our recent conversation. John basically retired from the field of artificial life when he had children. And I reflect on that very strongly, that there's something just amazing about having children. I'm a much older father than I probably should be. And just watching them discover things in language and, manipulate environments. I mean, I can't in any way program anything that is quite as wonderful as that. But I do think very strongly about various directions that the field has taken, specifically around language choices, simulation methodologies, these kind of things. I think there's a lot of new compute which is available, a lot of ways that can be used in the future. I'm very excited to see anything related to open source that emerges out of this. I'm always, as someone who's had a piece of open source for 28 years, when someone discovers a new way of using it or a new method of getting insight through it, I find that very exciting. In terms of your thinking, what does the next 10 years look like for A-Life? What excites you about the possibility in the next 10 years?
Well, for me, I am really excited to see the field grow into something that is much more well known. And I'm really excited to see it mature and become something that is as popular as like the field of, like AI, of course, right? AI is obviously like leaps and bounds, like orders and orders of magnitude much larger and much more. I wouldn't say successful is probably the wrong word, but I would say like more popular and more widely used and understood, and it's more obvious of like what the applications are. But for artificial life, I think that there's a lot of potential there, and I think that potential is untapped. And I'm really excited to see how that potential can start to take off. And in particular, I think that there are a few problems that like I can see becoming really popular. And, obviously like open-endedness is a really big one. And that's, being led by the charge is being led by Ken Stanley and Tim Taylor and tons of other people who are really amazing advocates for this problem. And not just like, oh yeah, we're making advancements in it, but I think more importantly, how to communicate why it's important for other fields. Like, why should we care? And, not just within the field, but like to other people, right? Writing lots of essays, working with other companies and starting whole teams, like that's amazing. I think also in the next 10 years, there's other aspects of artificial life that I can see get to that level as well. And one of them is this idea of swarm dynamics and embodiment in particular. Like, it's really fun to think about swarm dynamics and embodiment becoming an important thing for new technologies. So like you can have something like swarm robotics come together and swarm to do a particular function, like make me a screwdriver. Okay, now I have a screwdriver. Okay, like little swarm, now make me a step stool. Now it's a step stool. Like, okay, now perform this function, perform that function, become a computer. So I think that has the potential to change technology, absolutely. And then I would also say the third thing that is like the most important is obviously, I would say artificial chemistries. I think that that is going to like revolutionize, not just medicine, but also just revolutionize like what sorts of things that we can do with chemistry. I mean, like we understand chemical reactions from a non-living sense. Well, I mean, non-living in terms of like we can look at things, how things potentially work right now, and we can say, okay, like we know that metabolism in this particular cell has like this reaction, and then these proteins work together, and then like there's this particular enzyme. But also like making use of artificial life to build bridges there. So like for immunotherapy, for example, like CRISPR, I think, is a nice example of artificial life, I would say. Like you take something from living systems and you modify it, and you take advantage of it and you do new things with it. I think that artificial chemistries can make that even more efficient. So, these are just a few examples. I think that like Yeah, I'm super excited to see the field continue to mature. But I'm also really curious, like what do you think, Tom? Like what do you see in the next 10 years being really important?
Well, it was fascinating to get Ken Stanley back on. I mean, my view is that basically, if you look at OpenAI and that whole, generative AI discussion, artificial life's DNA is firmly a part of that. I mean, certainly watching Ken Stanley's trajectory through Uber and these kind of things, it was very difficult. I would much rather have done a pretty straight-laced interview with him, just talking about Uber to OpenAI, which he thankfully, by throwing in a kind of curveball question, he was able to give a very intimate account associated with OpenAI, which I thought was fascinating. But I've certainly felt that artificial life has falsely taken a back seat with regards to a lot of these things. I think with regards to moral and ethical positions, artificial life really should be making more strides. You've probably heard my conversations with Umi Khan associated with this kind of stuff as well. I think the next decade is going to be very fascinating associated with how these technologies are used, and in particular public criticism. I belong to quite a few not necessarily anti-generative AI groups, but certainly interested artists that would like to understand how they can utilize this technology for improvement rather than just obviously stealing their art. And I think there's an interesting discussion which is going on in parallel, which really the artificial life community could be leading in many regards. So having Ken Stanley back on and just being Ken Stanley in a perfect, I first interviewed him in 2006. And he was one of the top interviews that I did in terms of other people picking it up and people, basing their PhDs on, certain things that he did and things like that. So having him back on the recording was really and in video form with Tim Taylor was just absolutely amazing from me. I tried to keep my mic muted as long as possible, but I just had to ask the COVID question, which obviously spun the whole thing on its head. But yeah, it was wonderful to have Ken back on. And just reading both Ken and Tim's tweet associated with appearing in this thing, which I've just thrown together basically in a standard kind of shambolic fashion, just knowing a few people. I'd really like to get Steve Grand back into the conversation. I talk with Steve typically once a year. He's very camera shy. He's very mic shy as well. It usually requires a lot of prompting, and he does occasionally write emails to me, just abstract emails saying, why do you do this still? Why are you, what's the purpose of recording these conversations? And I think really it's always interesting to have to justify that position back to people. But I mean, certainly people such as yourself who are leading the charge with a completely different perspective historically from what I see the history of A life as being. You have your own view with regards to that, and more power to you in that vision. Because I think certainly the plurality of the field as it exists now is unique to this time. It's unique, I think, responsibly due to COVID more than anything, that a group of people who wouldn't historically have had anything to do with artificial life are now in the field. I don't know how ISIL operates. That was a secondary question for you as well, because obviously you're part of ERA, you're part of ISIL. I've historically been part of ISIL as well. But I think ISIL's moved in a direction that I just haven't had a chance to follow, basically since my last involvement with it. So what do you see these organizations as presenting, ERA, ISIL? What do you see them representing with regards to the future of artificial life?
Well, the first word that comes to my mind is energy. I see a lot of energy, and particularly with the ERA. I mean, like, I've never seen a early career organization grow this fast and have this much energy before. I've seen a lot of them get started. Like when I was in graduate school, I remember a few of them have got started. It's really hard to build like the momentum, the kind of momentum that the ERA has, which I think is absolutely incredible and super unique. And I think that people are coming in with so many fresh ideas, and everybody is really motivated to try new things and to get together and to share ideas and to collaborate and to move things forward, which is like just exactly the kind of place that I want to be. And it's the same thing with ISAL as well. You have a lot of people who have so much motivation to change and to move things forward and to discuss and to try things out. We have a lot of people who are involved in ISAL these days. Like it's a really, really large group. and it's also a lot of it's also has a really great mix of different perspectives. But I would say that everybody who's on the board is really motivated to try new things, which I think is just it's amazing to see. It's also like we had the board meeting during the conference, and a lot of the ideas that I heard from the conference attendees were being reflected by the people in the ICEL board meeting. They were saying, "This is what I've heard. Like, I think we should do this. I think we should work on like a textbook. I think we should work on different tracks for the conferences. I think we should really like start highlighting these early career researchers," which is extremely encouraging because I think that kind of energy is exactly the kind of thing that's going to drive this field forward. Because it's not just like one or two people pulling, right? It's like 10, 20, 30 people pulling in multiple different directions, but in a coordinated way because we all want the same thing. We all want artificial life to grow and to become like this explosive field that is making a huge impact on the world. So to see it in both these organizations is just like, oh my God, like it's why I wake up in the morning. It's so good.
It is fascinating. I mean, certainly participating in the Era talks and actually watching the crowd of people, particularly in the final day, when we were literally competing with space for the ISIL conference, it was interesting just the number of people and just the energy, the raw energy coming through that. And certainly it was something that I had to mention to Ken Stanley because he and I basically gave kind of bookend talks, and just to see the crowd and the community involvement was just amazing. Because reflecting on my only artificial life conference I've attended, which was in 2012, there were probably more people at the Era, conference than were at the ISIL, artificial life conference full population in 2012. And that gave me a really strong sense that the field not only has survived COVID, but has actually grown dramatically through COVID. And it's an interesting turning point from my perspective because coming into COVID, I just thought this was going to be the end of this thing. It was historic. It had a lot of history. I've interviewed a number of people that were part of the history, but I just couldn't see it actually surviving COVID. And the fact that it blossomed through COVID into what it is now, I just think is an amazing phenomenon. In terms of the audience, I don't know who watches these videos. I used to have a rough idea of who listened to the podcast. Any final thoughts, any closing topics that you'd like to raise?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Now let me get my oops, I had it up here, but then I lost it. Okay, yeah. So I also wanted to know like I'm really curious about your perspective about the history of A
Mhm,
life. And
mhm.
because I think like this is something that I don't like that I'm missing, right? Like I'm coming into it at a really I guess like recent time and I see these things that have been like really popular and I've stuck around, but I've also seen some things that have sort of like disappeared from the field. So but I want to understand like, from your perspective, like what's been the most important topics have been explored in A life so far, but also what's something that should be resurrected that just is no longer popular?
That's an interesting question. I mean, obviously my background is with regards to a particular kind of intelligent agent in a simulated environment. For the longest time, it wasn't even considered artificial life. So, I mean, I have a very curious history actually meeting on location at MSU with a particular professor who's very famous in the field, who told me that what I'd developed was just a game. It had no worthiness in this field. It was actually really good to meet a naysayer because rather than having just these imaginative naysayers that previously hadn't, passed on my work or done anything like that, to actually be in a room and having actually constructed so he had a team meeting following. And unfortunately, as these things happen, we were poking at something, it was crashing a little bit. I had to add some more code live. But that really gave me a sense. I mean, my background for the field primarily came from living in a very academic environment. I come from Canberra in Australia, where I spent my formative years. Canberra in Australia, the Australian National University was the predominant university. I couldn't do an artificial life philosophy degree there. I had a very strange set of experiences there, but I basically lived at the university from a relatively young age, worked at the University Physics Institution, did a bunch of programming and stuff like that. So artificial life for me was literally as I was starting university, realizing I couldn't actually do this field at university. It was too, polemic a topic at the time, and really a sense of a series of books. Margaret A. Bowden's Philosophy of Artificial Life is one that I return to frequently because it's just such an amazing surveying at the time. Obviously, you've got the likes of Stephen Levy, you have people such as Professor Adami, and obviously Hiroki, and people that have surveyed the field and produced these books. But I really feel very strongly that the field is in need of another Stephen Levy book. It's in need of another popular history, just to kind of catalogue the amazing stuff that's going on currently. When I speak both candidly and actively, you've seen me write emails to Tim Taylor, just trying to prompt something out of him in this regard, because I think it's a very, the history of the field, I don't think is lost on many of us, like those of us that remember. And certainly when you publish something in Artificial Life, you oftentimes get to see the history or the things that people enjoy. That's what I like about both Tim Taylor and Hiroki's work, is that you get, yes, that paper. Oh, I remember reading that paper. The way that this thing fits together. So from my perspective, I've recently created the Incredibly Old Researchers in Artificial Life as a joke in some regard, but also as a means for gathering together like-minded folk that are interested about exploring how we get away from Python, how we actually start integrating long-standing. I spent an evening. In fact, I actually contacted a fellow whose name was David Kerr, because I interviewed a fellow called Dave Kerr. They were actually different people, but he befriended me on LinkedIn, and I showed him what I'd done with the other David Kerr, and he's like, oh, now I understand why you got in contact with me. So, there are all these people who I've had a chance. Tom Ray was just fascinating to talk with, because you're literally, it's living history. You're talking to someone who's written so many seminal works in the field, and just the energy that you get from these people, it's quite addictive. So, I do have 18 years worth of podcasts, basically, which illustrates this in particular. But from my perspective, I think it's critical for a new group that are just interested. Dr. Khan, I'm trying to get into the Discord channel I've just created. He said, I'm not old enough yet. I'm like, okay, you've missed an element here. But my view is that all the new energy that is coming into the field is just amazing. And I think it's a responsibility for those of us that remember the past as well, to introduce it in a way which I think people are more conducive to. Cold War for me was just such a seminal concept as a boy growing up in Australia, that you could write code that would fight each other and dynamically, mutate and do all this other amazing stuff. And it's interesting actually, because interacting with Tim Taylor has just been really fascinating, because there are certain things that he has in his memory associated with the 90s, which are unique. He has a unique perspective with regards to that, and you need to cope certain elements out of it. It's one of the funny things that I found working with Tim, is that you'll have a conversation with him and reflect on a conversation that you had 3 weeks previous, where he missed that little nugget of information which would have made the previous discussion that much more interesting. So I think really it's your responsibility to humor people such as myself, people such as Tim Taylor, to try to extract some of the the fascinating histories. But also it's difficult to explain to new people in the field what an amazing discovery this was in the 90s. The computers which had been used for, well, you have Conway's Game of Life, you've got Golly, you've got all these things that come out of that. I'm looking forward to talking to Hiroki about that in particular. But you forget that these things were once new. Like, it's not that they've just been here forever, but actually there was a period of time where this was a new thing, and you discovered it anew. You discovered this aspect anew. You moved through it. There were things like Telnet and mailing lists that were old and bespoke, and I still used to have a very strong functionality associated with maintaining probably 2 of the leading artificial life publishing, with regards to projects and talks and things like that. I was terribly frustrated when I got to my previous employer and actually started giving A-Life talks, that I couldn't actually promote it through the ISIL mailing list, because they said, oh, no, that's not something that we promote. And so there were all these things over time that I think have left maybe a little PTSD, maybe a little memory scarring. But through all of this is just still the sense of youthful optimism. I reflect very heavily on John Klein, particularly as I had my daughters, thinking, now is the time, the monkey simulation, particularly after the comedian knocked you off Wikipedia, just like get on with your life, Tom. But no, I think it's people such as Dr. Khan. I mean, Dr. Khan, Tim Taylor introduced me to Dr. Khan 3 years ago. He enabled me to weather through COVID, having long, detailed discussions with him. I mean, Dr. Khan is just such a seminal figure in this field coming out of COVID. And I think I thanked him greatly for actually introducing us, because he just had the perfect energy for me and I had the perfect energy for him. And it's interesting because he sent me periodic messages just saying, I really love your stories. Keep your stories going. They're not always stories. Sometimes they're actually based on history. But no, Dr. Khan, I'm really pleased to consider a friend through this process as well. Dr. Adams, you were also a friend through this process. Thank you very much for your time today. It's been a real pleasure to chat with you.
Of course. Thank you so much. This was absolutely such a blast, and I loved our chat, and I'm looking forward to chatting more.